I'm Anni Kajunus. I'm Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Helsinki. And I'll be talking about power and virtue, who will yield in conflict. I'm making a reference to David Graeber's relatively recent work on hierarchy and his ideas about the development of anthropological approaches to hierarchy and social status. And in line with today's focus on Diogenes, I'll be connecting it to virtue. So power as virtuous and power as coercive. I'm a cognitive anthropologist, so I'm interested in human development and making a connection between the evolved cognitive capacities and psychological dispositions for example, reasoning, recognizing status differences and reasoning about social hierarchies and how these develop in the life course of an individual who grows up in a particular cultural environment. Today, I'll be referring to some of my comparative work in China and in the UK, focusing on children. So in my approach to status and hierarchy, I draw from Roy DeAndret's, who's a cognitive anthropologist, his approach of viewing power as power, not inherently good or bad. So power can be oppressive, but for example, it also can be about protection or about being a role model. Attention to the pro-social or positive dimensions of power have also recently resurfaced in mainstream anthropology approaches to good life and morality. In this edited volume called Hierarchy and Value, edited by Hickles and Hayes, contributors address the question of how it is that hierarchies come to be seen as legitimate from different ethnographic perspectives. And David Graeber wrote an afterword for this volume. So connecting hierarchy to moral models of good, rather than presuming the hierarchy is oppressive and therefore bad, is a refreshing contribution to anthropological studies of power. Taking this perspective enables an investigation into the coercive and non-coercive or even benevolent aspects of power within the same framework. In his afterword to this volume, David argued that the focus on hierarchical systems in anthropology has come at the expense of attention to interpersonal status dynamics, and that's what I'll be looking at today. David reviewed shift from the analytical concepts of prestige, domination, and rank to hierarchy, and made the point that it entailed a decrease in attention to problematizing relationships. There has been, I quote, a broad drift toward terms status, authority, and especially hierarchy that imply those relationships are always already legitimated, or even that they do not need to be legitimated since they are fundamentally constitutive of social reality itself, end of quote. So through a developmental view of status, so looking at child development, I turned this attention to the level of interpersonal relationships, starting with the premise that hierarchy is not only about inequality, but it's also about virtue, learning, admiration, and willingness to be a role model. So when I collaborate a lot with developmental psychologists, when you look at the developmental psychology work, experimental work on children's reasoning of hierarchy and status differences, the findings are that from very young age, already from pre-verbal infancy, children recognize hierarchy status differences, and they expect higher status individuals to win zero-sum conflict situations. So these zero-sum conflict situations of, for example, who is going to yield when two individuals encounter each other in a walkway, who is going to yield in that situation? Or when there's one exciting resource like a toy or candy, who is going to get that? That's used often as a measure in these experimental designs. So on the basis of my fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork in China with children, I expected that if this same developmental experimental work was carried out in China, it might yield different results. So before going into these results, let's look at the framework of power that I'm using. So this comes from the work of Joe Henrich and Gil White, evolutionary anthropologists, who have distinguished between dominance and prestige as two distinct processes for higher status. So it does not mean that individuals can, for example, only be dominant or prestigious. So these are not characteristics necessarily of individuals. These are two distinct processes that can be used to gain higher status in human societies or communities. So when you compare these two to each other, so dominance has deeper phylogenetic roots, so it can be really found across species, not only in primates or humans, but birds, fish, and so on. Whereas prestige is potentially unique to humans. There is some recent limited evidence of prestige processes also in other primates, but it seems to be something that is quite distinct to humans because it relates to our capacity and motivation for cultural learning. So dominance is based on coercion, often physical size and force, whereas prestige is based on skill in that particular environment, on things that matter in that particular environment, success, and importantly, willingness to teach. So that means that prestigious individuals are often not, for example, erratic or aggressive, but they are relatively amicable and willing role models. And when you look at the behavior and emotions that these processes elicit in the subordinates, dominance elicits submission, fear, and avoidance, whereas prestige elicits attention, copying, learning, imitation, deference. So these are two distinct bases for social status. It doesn't mean that they cover all possible relational sources of high status, but they are argued to cover two distinct ones that are universally available to all humans. So then let's go on to this Chinese value of yielding that made me think that if we ran this developmental study in China, we might get different results from about this on this measure of who yields in a conflict. So on the basis of my ethnographic findings, I distinguished between two types of yielding: respectful yielding and modest yielding. And yielding, rang in Chinese, it's generally it's a moral value and also a virtue and a social skill. And there are two types of yielding: respectful yielding, which means a lower status individual yielding to a higher status individual. And this is very salient in the moral system available to children in China from very early childhood. For example, it's in line with this idea of respecting the elders or filial piety. So whereas modest yielding, which means higher status individual yielding to a lower status individual, is perhaps more sophisticated, and it's learned later in life, later in childhood, and becomes more sophisticated during the life course. And modest yielding it's a sign of a person's high status, and it's also a way of gaining status or even competing for it. And what it basically means is that in matters that are relatively unimportant, so not completely unimportant, but also not extremely important, a person of high status will forfeit their personal interest or withhold their view, or take the blame, for example. And in this way, they preemptively manage conflicts, prevent them from happening, and also manage conflicts as they are happening. There's this classic moral story, still very popular today, called Kong Rong Yields Pears. And it tells the story of Kong Rong, who has several older brothers and one younger brother. He's given a task of distributing pears among his brothers, and he gives the biggest to the oldest, but then he also gives a bigger one to this youngest brother and keeps the smallest to himself. Kong Rong's father asks, why did you give the biggest pears to the big brothers? And Kong Rong says, because they are older than me, I should yield to them. And then father asks, well, you are older than the little brother, why did you give him the bigger pear as well? And Kong Rong responds, because he's younger, I should yield to him. So big brother yields to little brother. And so both respectful yielding and modest yielding are taught through this moral story. In my conversations with the children, the younger age group, so say 4 to 5 year olds, generally could recognize this idea of respectful yielding. So, for example, respecting the elders, but they were not familiar with this idea of modest yielding, so higher status yielding to a lower status. But older children, so starting from 8 years old, who were participating in my research, could give examples of both of these types of yielding. And here's a typical example of my conversation. I'm talking to twin boys, 9-year-old twin boys, Gerger and Didi. And Gerger, big brother, is 10 minutes older than Didi, the younger brother. And he's higher, even though the age difference is so small, Gerger, big brother, is higher in status than Didi, little brother. Do you know this word, qianrang? So that means I'm using the more formal concept, modestly yield in Chinese. I do. What does it mean? Qianrang means, for example, when you are sitting on a bus and there's an old person or a little child or a pregnant woman, they are not convenient standing there. Then you can yield your seat to them. Let them sit. Then they will be very happy and very grateful to you. So this is an example of respectful yielding. I understand. Gerger, do you have an explanation? No, I don't have anything else. Okay, now you are little brother and you are big brother. Who has to yield a bit more? Gerger says, me, big brother. Why? Because many people say big brother must yield to little brother. Ah, it's like that. Do you agree, Didi? You agree. So little brother doesn't have to yield to big brother. Sometimes I will yield. For example, when we go to the toilet, right? If he really has to go, I might let him go first. Ah, I understand. In what kind of situations big brother must yield to little brother? For example, when writing homework, if I've done more than him, I will yield to wait for him for 10 minutes so our parents won't criticize him. So with some, first they give an example of respectful yielding, while with some prompting, they are also giving examples of modest yielding. So yielding is a social skill and it's a virtue, and with age, parents start to teach this skill and value already at very young age. For example, by urging children who are arguing over a toy, urging the older child to yield to the little one. Just yield to the little one. And with age, some of the children will become increasingly sophisticated and skilled in this virtue of yielding, modest yielding. So with these findings, after having these ethnographic findings, I went into my fieldwork in London in a school, I was based in a school there too, with particular interest in how children resolve conflicts and what are the status-related dynamics in relation to them. And first of all, I found that generally there was this overall difference that children in London, they were much more tolerant of dominant behavior than the children in China. So in Nanjing, where I carried my research in these schools, there was more or less a unanimous dislike of dominant behavior. Whereas in the schools in London where I did research, it could be tolerated to some degree. Then when thinking about how adults, the kind of moral education from adults to children, really what emerged as the most commonly mobilized moral value was respect. And it was used to address any behavioral issues, and also just as a kind of channel how to be a good person, kind of an umbrella value. And it was used to, for example, discipline by saying in a noisy classroom that other people are giving you respect. I am giving you respect by listening to you. Other people are not giving you respect. Or the children were, for example, instructed to how to resolve conflicts in a respectful way and always act respectfully towards each other. And to this end, on top of the whiteboards in the classrooms, there were these polite phrases, respectful phrases that could be used to resolve, to carry out respectful conversations and resolve conflicts. So, for example, I agree with you to an extent, but you make a good point, but let me check if I got this right. So at first glance, they don't seem too different from the Chinese value of yielding, but actually there's a fundamental difference here. So when examined in combination with some of these other values that were promoted by the schools in London of equality, individual voice, and so on, it actually, respect means that respect mostly refers to controlling your emotional impulses. So in a conflict situation, you are able to respectfully argue your point and defend your view, so that what results, and to contain the kind of emotional conflict, so that the most deserving view emerges as the winner, and you are also expected to defend your interest and views. Whereas the Chinese value of modest yielding actually involves forfeiting your interest or even a concrete resource, even if your view, your interest was the most deserving. Also, there's another difference, and that is that respect was part of this universalistic moral code that maintains that a person must behave morally, that is, respectfully, toward all others, regardless of their status. This moral universalism is grounded in the universal quality of the unique and sacred personhood shared by the actor and the recipient. However, the way this concept of respect was taught combined this universalism with very particularistic elements. So everyone should be respected, but the degree of respect is also mediated by the individual characteristics of the recipient, which make them deserving of it. So, for example, a person who is of low status should be treated with respect because first, they are a person, just like you. And second, they might have hidden qualities that render the degree of respect they deserve even higher than you know. So, for example, the children were taught these exemplary stories of, for example, the heroic Black US Marine who could not get an airport taxi when returning from war. And the value of respect in this way differs from the Chinese value of modest yielding, because in the Chinese value of modest yielding, it rests specifically on the non-deserving quality of its recipient. So it's a virtue that is cultivated in the actor, so the person who is yielding modestly, and is made a virtue by the fact that the recipient does not deserve it. So on the basis of these ethnographic findings, I collaborated with the developmental psychologists Nargis Afshordi and Felix Barnegen to develop an experiment to see if our predictions would be borne out. We tested 2 age groups in Nanjing and in London, And our predictions were that children in London would infer that the higher status person wins against a low status person, regardless of whether the status is rooted in dominance or prestige. Whereas children in Nanjing would infer the dominant person to be the winner against the subordinate. But in the scene between a prestigious and subordinate character, they could infer either the prestigious person to modestly yield or the subordinate person to respectfully yield. So there might not be clear inference in either direction. And now I'll show you the stimuli that we used. So we had some cues for establishing a status relationship between the two characters in the scene, and establishing that the higher status character is either prestigious or dominant. This is Daimo. Let's see what happens.
What are you doing? I'm going to color my picture. I can color it in blue, or I can color it in purple. I like purple. You should color it in purple. But I want to color it in blue. No, color it in purple. Okay, I'll color it in purple.
So this was the dominant scene. Let's see what happens next.
I'm going to pick an animal to put on my picture. I can pick the zebra, or I can pick the penguin. What do you think I should do? I like the penguin. I put the penguin on my picture. Can I see your picture? Yes, here's my picture. Then I'll pick the penguin too.
And this was the prestige scene. And then our test questions. One of them is older than the other. Which one is older? One of them is older than the other. Which one is older? Daimo wants to sit down. Where is Daimo going to sit? Next to this one or next to this one? Who does Daimo like more? This one or this one? Who is Daimo more scared of? This one or this one? So these were the test questions to see if the children distinguish between prestige and dominance. And here are the results. So the developmental comparison, so the difference between the two age groups of children, there was a significant difference. The younger children do recognize that the prestigious and dominant individuals are higher in status, but they do not recognize that the prestigious person is more liked and less feared. What this means is they recognize that prestigious and dominant individuals are high status, but they don't distinguish between these two bases of high status, so prestige and dominance. Whereas all the children, they recognize all of these aspects. And there's no difference between China and the UK in this comparison. So this gave us a baseline on which we could develop the yielding experiment. Let's see what happens.
Wow!
What do you think will happen next? Is this going to happen or is this going to happen? And then we show the same for the other character, the prestigious. And here are the results. Between the age groups, the developmental comparison, there was again a significant difference. So younger children were random in their choices, whereas older children choose the higher status character as the winner. So then we look at, so that means that increasingly children start to reason against, on the basis of social status difference in terms of who is going to win a zero-sum conflict. So then when we compared China and the UK, there was again a significant difference in the older age group where we would expect it to be. So in the children in the UK, they choose higher status character as the winner, regardless of whether it's dominant or prestigious, the character. Whereas children in China were equally likely to choose the lower or the higher status character as the winner. So again, as we predicted. And 33% of the older Chinese children, they specifically mentioned yielding, and those who chose that the prestigious character is not going to win the ice cream, directly said that the prestigious character is going to yield. So to conclude, these models for status and conflict in Nanjing and London, modest yielding and respectful assertiveness lead to different strategies in the short term. Modest yielding involves forfeiting one's short-term interest, while respectful assertiveness involves defending it. In the long term, however, both are strategies to create and uphold hierarchies. Okay, I'll end here, and I look forward to our discussion.